It was a quiet Sunday morning in the small Cornish town of St. Ives. The gulls cried above the harbour, and the salty wind rattled the shutters of Margaret Whitmore's seaside cottage. The house, with its creaking beams and ivy crawling along the stone walls, had been in her family for generations. To Margaret, it was not simply a home. It was memory, heritage, and the last gift of her late husband, Edward. She was preparing tea when a frantic knock rattled the front door. Startled, Margaret set down the teapot and opened it. Standing there was her only son, Daniel. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, and his shirt buttons were mismatched as though he had dressed in a hurry. "Mum," he blurted, his voice trembling. "I need your help. Please, let me in." Margaret stepped aside, her heart tightening. Daniel stumbled into the parlor, pacing like a man trapped in a cage. His hands shook as he ran them through his hair. "What is it, Daniel?" Margaret asked softly, though dread already coiled in her stomach. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting everywhere but hers. "I'm in trouble. Serious trouble. I owe people money, Mum. A lot of money. If I don't pay soon, they'll..." He broke off, his voice cracking. Margaret's knees weakened, and she gripped the arm of a chair for balance. "How much?" she whispered. Daniel finally looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips trembling. "Tens of thousands. I cannot manage it alone. The only way is if you sell this house. It would clear everything." For a moment the room felt colder, as though the sea breeze had slipped through the walls. Sell the house. The Whitmore cottage was all she had left, the anchor of her life. To part with it would be like cutting away her own heart. Yet as she looked into Daniel's desperate eyes, she felt the pull of a mother's love. He was her only son, her only family. If he was truly in danger, could she refuse him? Margaret lowered herself into the armchair, her hands trembling in her lap. "Let me think, Daniel. You cannot rush me into something like this." But even as she spoke, she sensed there was something Daniel was not telling her. His voice, his eyes, there was fear, yes, but also a shadow of guilt. A secret lingered behind his words, a secret he dared not confess. And in that moment, Margaret realized that whatever trouble Daniel had brought to her door was far darker than he wanted her to believe. Margaret sat in the kitchen, the old clock ticking against the silence. The kettle hissed faintly on the stove, steam curling into the air. She had not expected Daniel to appear at her door so early, his face pale, his coat thrown on as though he had come in a hurry. He did not even greet her properly. He went straight to the table, pulled out a chair, and slumped into it. Margaret studied him, noticing the tremor in his hands and the way he avoided her eyes. "Mother," he said finally, his voice hoarse, "I need your help. It is serious this time." Margaret's heart tightened. She had heard such words before, but never with this level of desperation. She poured him tea, sliding the cup across the table, though he did not touch it. "What has happened, Daniel?" she asked softly. His eyes darted towards hers, then away again. "I owe money, more than I can pay. They will not wait any longer. If I do not clear it soon, things will turn very ugly for me." The words dropped like stones between them. Margaret's fingers gripped the edge of the table. She thought of her late husband, of the years they had spent building a life together, of the small comfort the house gave her now. Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Mother, the only way out is to sell the house. Yours. It is worth enough to cover my debt and give me a chance to start over." For a long moment, Margaret did not speak. The walls of the kitchen seemed to close in, the hum of the clock suddenly unbearably loud. "Sell the house," she whispered. "This house is all I have left, Daniel. Your father built it with his hands." "I know," he said quickly, his tone edged with urgency. "But if I lose to them, I lose everything. You do not understand the sort of men I am dealing with. They will not forgive. He clasped his hands together as though in prayer, his eyes wet, pleading. I am begging you, Mother. If you do this for me, I will change. I will never fall into trouble again. Margaret looked at her son, the boy she had raised, the man who now seemed like a stranger. In that instant, torn between love and dread, she felt the earth shift beneath her feet. She could not yet know that his words hid more than just fear, that behind them lay a truth darker than she could imagine. The following evening, as Margaret tried to steady her thoughts with a cup of tea, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp against the quiet of the Cornish dusk. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly before she opened the door. A man stood there. He was tall, with a pale face marked by sleepless nights and a suit that looked expensive yet carelessly worn. He introduced himself as Mr. Edward Harrow, speaking with a calmness that unsettled her. I believe your son owes me a considerable sum, he said smoothly, his eyes never leaving hers. And I also believe he promised me something quite valuable in return. A house, to be exact. Margaret's blood ran cold. She had not told a soul about the possibility of selling her home. The fact that this stranger knew sent shivers down her spine. Edward stepped forward slightly, lowering his voice. Your son has been frequenting certain establishments in Truro. He is not merely unlucky, Mrs. Whitmore. He is reckless. Gambling tables, card games, debts upon debts. And he used your home as a lure. The words struck Margaret like blows. She tried to gather her strength, though her voice betrayed her. You are mistaken. This house is mine. Daniel has no right. Edward gave a thin smile. Rights are fragile things when debts are involved. He left a small card on the hall table, bowing his head politely before retreating into the night. Margaret closed the door quickly and leaned against it, her breath short. Her heart raced not only with fear but with a dawning resolve. If Daniel thought he could gamble away her home, then he had underestimated her. But before she could confront her son, a new dread grew inside her. If Edward Harrow could find her here, who else might come knocking? And just as she reached for the telephone to call Daniel, a shadow moved across her garden path. Someone else was watching the house. Margaret awoke the next morning to the sound of rain tapping lightly against the window panes. The grey Cornish sky mirrored the heaviness in her heart. She moved slowly about the kitchen, making tea, her hands trembling as she set the porcelain cup on the table. She knew Daniel would return today with the papers. When the knock finally came, she felt her breath catch. Daniel entered swiftly, his suit damp from the rain, his eyes darting with nervous energy. He placed a brown envelope on the kitchen table with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. It is simple, Mother, he said softly. Just a few signatures and everything will be sorted. You will not have to worry anymore. Margaret sat opposite him, staring at the envelope as though it were a serpent coiled and ready to strike. Her instincts screamed against it, yet she forced her face into calmness. She reached out, touching the corner of the paper, and felt the weight of what was hidden within. Daniel, she whispered, tell me honestly. If I do this, will you be free? His jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment his gaze faltered. Yes, he replied quickly, too quickly. You must trust me. Margaret opened the envelope slowly, her eyes moving across the legal contract. Her name was printed in neat black ink beside his, and the house, her only home, was listed as the asset to be sold. She saw lines that did not make sense, clauses buried in the text that spoke of third parties and silent partners. Her heart thudded. Daniel shifted in his seat, drumming his fingers on the table. He avoided her gaze. The room grew cold. Margaret closed the papers and folded her hands carefully upon them. She smiled faintly, hiding the storm that raged inside. I see, she said quietly. Then let us meet tomorrow at the solicitor's office. If everything is proper, I shall sign. Daniel exhaled with visible relief, his shoulders dropping. You are saving me, Mother, he whispered, kissing her hand before leaving the house. But as the door closed, Margaret's smile faded. She slid the papers back into the envelope and tucked it away in her bureau. The truth shimmered just out of reach, but she was certain of one thing: Daniel was not telling her everything. And by tomorrow, she intended to uncover what he was truly hiding. The following morning dawned pale and misty, the sea beyond the cliffs hidden in a veil of white. Margaret dressed carefully, fastening her dark coat with slow precision. She tucked the brown envelope into her handbag, the weight of it pressing against her side as though it carried not papers but secrets. On her way to the solicitor's office, she stopped briefly at the village shop. Mrs. Cartwright, the elderly shopkeeper, greeted her with a smile, but as Margaret stepped forward to pay, she noticed a figure outside. A man in a dark coat leaned against the lamppost, watching her intently. When their eyes met, he quickly turned away, pretending to light a cigarette. Margaret's pulse quickened. She left the shop with her purchases and hurried towards the main street. Yet at every corner, the man seemed to appear again, silent, persistent, as though shadowing her path. By the time she reached the solicitor's office, her nerves were taut. Daniel was already inside, pacing the floor. He looked up with a strained smile. You came, he said, taking her arm firmly. Good. Let us get this over with. But as they waited for Mr. Henshaw, the family solicitor, the door opened quietly. The same man from the street stepped in. His presence filled the room, and Daniel stiffened instantly. I apologize for the intrusion, the man said, his voice low yet commanding. He turned his gaze to Margaret. Mrs. Whitcomb, may I have a word with you in private? It concerns the papers you are about to sign. Daniel's face paled. He rose sharply. This is not the time. You have no business here. The man's eyes narrowed. On the contrary, I have every business here. If she signs those documents, she will lose far more than her home. Margaret gripped her handbag, her heart hammering. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to bend the air. And in that silence, she realized the truth. This stranger knew something Daniel had desperately tried to hide. The man closed the door behind him, shutting out the hum of the office beyond. The room felt smaller now, the air charged with unspoken tension. Margaret remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap, though her knuckles whitened. Daniel hovered at her side, his voice sharp with anger. You will not speak to her, he hissed. Leave at once, or I shall call the constable. The stranger ignored him. His eyes, steady and piercing, fixed only on Margaret. My name is Edward Clark, he said evenly. I once knew your late husband, Mrs. Whitcomb. He helped me in a matter of grave importance many years ago. That favor has bound me to your family ever since. And it is because of that bond I'm here today. Margaret's breath caught. You knew Henry? She whispered. Edward inclined his head. I did. And if he was still alive, he would tell you not to sign away your home. What your son asks is not what it seems. He is entangled with men who would see you ruined, and once your house is gone, you will be at their mercy. Daniel's face flushed crimson. He stepped forward, fists clenched. This is slander. Lies and inventions to frighten her. Mother, you must not listen. But Edward did not flinch. He placed a sealed envelope upon the desk between them. These are letters. Proof of dealings your son would rather keep hidden. Read them, and you will understand the danger. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the envelope. Daniel lunged, but she pulled it back, her eyes wide with dawning fear. Sit down, Daniel, she said softly, though her voice carried a steel he had never heard from her before. For once, you will let me decide. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Only the distant sound of the village clock striking the hour broke it. Margaret held the envelope to her chest, knowing whatever it contained would shatter the fragile trust she still clung to. And as she looked between the two men, the son she loved and the stranger who bore warnings, she realized her next choice might change everything. The envelope lay upon Margaret's lap, heavy though it held only paper. She stared at the seal, fingers trembling, as if opening it would summon something she was not prepared to face. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Mother, do not read those. They are forgeries. This man is trying to poison you against me." But Margaret did not look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the envelope, and when at last she broke the seal, the silence in the room deepened to something unbearable. The first letter was written in Daniel's hand. She knew his script as well as her own. The words were filled with desperate bargains, pledges of money he did not have, promises made to names she did not recognize. Yet one line froze her blood. "If I cannot deliver the house, then she must bear the consequence." She read the sentence again and again, her lips moving silently. It was her life, her home, her very safety he had offered away. Her hands shook as she lowered the letter. Daniel snatched at it, but Edward was quicker, placing a firm hand upon his arm. "You will not silence the truth with violence," Edward said. Margaret pressed the papers to her breast as though to shield herself. Her voice quivered when she spoke. "Daniel, how could you?" His eyes burned with fury, but beneath it was something else, fear. "I had no choice," he muttered. "They gave me no way out. If you love me, you will help me." But Margaret, for the first time in her life, saw her son not as a boy in need of saving, but as a man who had chosen his path. And that path led her towards ruin. She rose slowly from her chair, every movement deliberate, as though gathering strength from the very ground beneath her. "I will not sign," she said quietly, yet the words filled the room like thunder. Daniel's face darkened. "Then you condemn me." The weight of his words lingered in the air, and Margaret knew the storm between them had only begun to break. Rain lashed against the windows of the cottage as night fell. The house, once a place of warmth, seemed now a prison where truth and betrayal clashed in every corner. Margaret sat at the table, the letters spread before her like pieces of evidence at a trial. Daniel paced the room, his face pale, his hands clenched. "You do not understand. If you do not give me the deed, they will come for me. They will not stop. And they will not spare you either." Edward stood by the doorway, calm but watchful. "You are wrong, Daniel. They already have what they want, your desperation. But your mother will not pay for your folly." Daniel's voice cracked. "It is not folly. It is survival." He turned to Margaret, his eyes wet, though not with remorse but with fury. "You owe me this. I am your son. Without you, I am nothing." Margaret rose slowly, her heart breaking yet firm. "And with you, I lose everything I have left. My home. My peace. My very self. You are my son, Daniel, but you are not the boy I raised. You are a stranger wearing his face." The words struck him harder than any blow. His lips parted, but no defense came. Then, as if seized by madness, Daniel lunged for the letters. His chair crashed to the floor, his hands clawing across the table. But Edward was faster, blocking him, holding him back with a strength born of resolve. "Enough," Edward said through clenched teeth. "You will not destroy her life any longer." The struggle ended as swiftly as it began. Daniel wrenched free, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. For a moment, he looked ready to strike, but something in Margaret's face stopped him. Not fear. Not anger. But sorrow, deep, endless sorrow. He staggered backwards, his voice a whisper. "Then I am truly alone." Without another word, he turned and fled into the storm, the door slamming behind him. Margaret's knees weakened, and Edward caught her before she fell. The letters slipped from her hand to the floor, their secrets bare for all to see. Outside, the rain swallowed Daniel's footsteps, leaving only silence. The house stood untouched, yet Margaret knew that nothing within it would ever be the same again. Morning crept slowly over the moors, the mist clinging to the earth as though reluctant to let go of the night. The cottage was quiet now, save for the faint crackle of the dying fire. Margaret sat in her chair by the window, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes fixed on the grey horizon. Edward moved silently about the room, gathering the scattered letters, folding them with care. He did not ask where Daniel had gone, nor did he speak of what might come next. Some truths, he knew, weighed too heavily for words. Margaret's hand rested upon the worn wood of the table, her fingers tracing invisible patterns. Her heart felt heavier than it had the night before, not because of fear but because of absence. She had driven her son away, not with anger, but with truth. A truth that had severed whatever fragile bond remained. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the glass. The path that led away from the house was empty, but Margaret could almost see him still, a boy with muddy boots, laughing as he ran home from the fields. That boy lived only in memory now. Edward placed the letters into a drawer and closed it softly. He looked at Margaret, his voice low. He may come back. Or he may not. But you still have a home. You still have your strength. Margaret gave no reply. She simply kept her gaze on the mist, her thoughts drifting with it, as though searching for a figure who would never again appear upon that lonely road. The fire gave one last sigh before falling into embers. The silence that followed was deep, the kind that clings to walls and lingers in the soul. And in that silence, Margaret understood that the echoes of her son's footsteps would haunt her far longer than his presence ever had.